Spiral trellis stitch is trellis stitch worked in a spiral to fill a circle or oval shape. Here's an example of spiral trellis. Trellis stitch was a popular technique in 17th century English embroidery, but then it fell out of favor until it was rediscovered in the 20th century. Now, with the resurgence of interest in freestyle or surface embroidery, trellis stitch is making another comeback. Today, the preferred variation seems to be spiral trellis, probably because it's so useful and pretty. So now let's look at how spiral trellis stitch is done. First, you have to draw the circle shape that you want to fill. And here I've drawn a circle with a friction marker, but you could really use any kind of marker because these lines will be covered by the stitch. Next, you have to lay the foundation for the spiral trellis. Now, I like to use back stitch for the foundation because this stitch makes a nice, flat, secure outline. So that's what I've started to do here with this circle. Now, here's a pro tip. When you're doing your back stitch, especially when you're doing a foundation stitch, use a stab stitch motion. That is where you go stab it in and pull through and then back up. Do not do it with a sewing or scooping motion because you will not get as precise a stitch. So I'm going to go in here. Now, when you're doing these back stitches, you also need to be careful not to make your stitches too small. And stitches, especially when you're working on wool, are generally going to be smaller than you think they will be. So be sure that your stitches are big enough, and you'll see why that's important. Now I'll make just a few more stitches here. So notice I'm doing a stab stitch. Flip the needle around and stab it straight back in. That way you'll get a nice, tidy back stitch. So I'll go back in and then make one last back stitch here to close up this circle. Now, before I start my trellis stitch, because trellis stitch uses a lot of thread, I would usually knot off and then come in with a new thread. But I'm not going to do that here because this is just for practice. So I'll come up here between any two threads near the beginning of my circle. And now I'm going to start my trellis stitch, the first round. So I'm going to work clockwise around this circle. So you'll bring your needle under that first back stitch, loop it around the needle, and you're going to loop it around the needle counterclockwise, and then pull through. And this will form a little knot. Now, as you pull through, it's a good idea to secure that knot with your thumb so that you'll get a nice, tidy knot in that first back stitch. Now I'm going to go over to the next back stitch, bring my thread around in the same way, and pull through. Now we have two trellis stitches. Now make sure that when you pull your knots, that you can see that little bridge between the two knots. That's why it's good to have your knots not too tiny, because you need to be able to have bridges between those two knots. So you'll continue working all the way around the circle. Then when you get to all the way around the circle, now here I have come around, I just have one more back stitch to do. So I'll go in there, bring my thread around, and pull through. Now I have completed the first round. Now to do the second round, find that bridge between the first and second trellis stitches. Don't go in here. go all the way over to that first little bridge, and then start your second round doing that same trellis stitch. So for this round, you're going to be going between those trellis stitches. Now just go into the bridge. Don't go all the way through so that you're going under that back stitch. Just go through those little bridges and work around in a circle in the same direction. Now, at this point, it doesn't really look much like a trellis stitch, so you might be thinking, okay, this is kind of a disaster, but you just have to have faith that this will start to turn into a nice, pretty trellis stitch. And that's what's happening here. I have gone around and around a couple of times, so now it's starting to really look like a trellis stitch. Now, when you're doing the trellis stitch, though, two things will begin to happen. First of all, as you can imagine, since your circle is getting smaller and smaller, your stitches will become too crowded. So when that happens, what you need to do is, see, I would have been going into this little bridge here, but you can begin to skip stitches. So I'm going to just skip that stitch here and go around here. And it should not leave a hole, because when you skip a stitch, you can just sort of get your stitches organized, use your thumb to pinch them together, and keep organizing it into a circle going towards the center. Also, the other thing that will happen is that you will start to run out of thread. Obviously, I'm not going to make it all the way around this trellis stitch with this little bit of thread that I have. So here's the way you bring in a new thread. Now, you might be just bringing in some of the same thread, or you might want to change colors, because that is a nice way to get a pretty effect by having multiple colors of thread in your trellis stitch. So I'm just going to park my needle over here and then thread another needle with my new thread. And these are, by the way, size 5 pearl cottons that I'm using today, and they are threaded into size 22 chenille needle. So see where that last trellis stitch came out onto that little bridge? I'm going to go back here, come through from the back, and come into that same place and pull through, and then just continue doing the trellis stitches with my new thread. So we'll just make a couple of stitches here, and now you have your new thread started. Now, of course, we've still got to get rid of that old thread. So what I do then is I just bring that old thread to the back and fasten it off. And then when you come around, just make sure to pay attention to where that space is, so that you can just make a nice smooth transition. Now, to end trellis stitch, and here I've come down to, it would have been better if I had more thread, but I don't. So but I've got this circle almost closed up. So I'm just going to kind of pull the circle together. You don't want to have too many rows, because if you don't pull your circle together, you're going to end up with a kind of a puffy or cone shape. So you do want to keep pulling your circle together and flattening it as you get smaller. And then to end it, I'm just going to go across the circle to the stitch right across from where I have done my last trellis stitch, and then just pull through and then secure the thread on the back. So there is a nice spiral trellis stitch. Now, spiral trellis stitch in this situation is just a solid, completely filled circle, and that's what I also did on this queen triggerfish that you can see on our Etsy shop, the McAvoy sisters. Here's another situation where I used a spiral trellis stitch, and I added some things to it. So you can see that in this case I didn't complete the spiral trellis stitch. I stopped here so that I left this open space in the center. Then I just did this little eyelet stitch in the center with a French knot, and then put French knots around the outside. So you could also do something like that with your spiral trellis stitch.